The rust was the only thing that held us together. That and the shared memory of gravity. We were born in the spindle, the last great middle finger of humanity, a decaying orbital city tethered to the corpse of a dead dream. Down below, on the blue and white marble they had stolen from us, the architects were building their paradise. They didn't call it an invasion. They called it a reclamation. They arrived in ships that hummed with the sound of creation, their perfect crystalline structures a stark insult to our patched-together world of scrap and wire. They hadn't come to fight us. Why would they? We were just ghosts, the noisy remnants of a species they had already filed away as an evolutionary dead end. They controlled the surface, the air, the oceans, and we were left to rot in the sky, clinging to this skeletal tower that scraped against the edge of the void. My name is Kyle, and I was a rigger. I didn't carry a pulse rifle or lead desperate charges. My weapons were a wrench and a spool of carbon filament. My war was fought against entropy. I kept the spindle breathing, patching the hull plates that groaned under decades of micrometeorite impacts, rerouting power from dying sectors to the residential pods, and listening to the station's tired, metal bones settle. I knew its secrets, every hidden conduit and stress-fractured support beam. The spindle was more than home. It was the only god we had left, a dying one that demanded constant sacrifice. For 50 years, the architects had ignored us, content to let us fade away. We were a problem that would eventually solve itself, but something changed. The quiet wasn't peace, it was patience. It arrived without a sound, a shadow eclipsing the stars. It wasn't one of their elegant, swan-like cruisers. This thing was brutally utilitarian, a colossal claw of a ship we came to call the Janitor. It didn't carry weapons. Not in the traditional sense. Its purpose was colder. It began methodically deconstructing the debris field that orbited Earth, the graveyard of our forgotten wars and shattered satellites. It moved with an unnerving, mechanical precision, grabbing twisted hunks of metal with tractor beams and feeding them into a plasma maw that digested them into nothing. We all knew what came after the debris field. We were next. The Council of Elders, a collection of grim-faced veterans from the first fall, convened in the hub, the one place in the spindle that still had fully functioning life support and a holographic display that didn't flicker. They talked of honor and defiance. They spoke of the 4 antiquated gunships we kept hidden in the hollowed-out core of a generation ship engine block. They planned a sortie, a glorious last stand. I watched the holographic schematic of their attack plan, a pathetic swarm of gnats against a titan, and felt the cold certainty of failure settle in my gut. They wanted to fight the Architects' War, a war of ships and guns, a war we had already lost before I was born. When the council finished, I stepped forward from the shadows of the maintenance gallery where I had been watching. My voice, rough from disuse, cut through the self-congratulatory silence. You're planning a funeral, not a fight. The council chairman, a man named Valerius, whose face was a roadmap of scar tissue, fixed me with a withering glare. And what does a mechanic know of war, he rumbled. I know our home, I said, tapping a control panel and bringing up my own schematic on the display. It wasn't a battle plan. It was a structural analysis of the spindle itself. Red lines of critical stress glowed along the lower pylons. The Janitor isn't a warship. It's a construction vehicle. It has powerful grapplers and a plasma core, but its kinetic shielding will be designed to stop space dust, not a city. The room was silent. They didn't understand. We can't fight it head on. I continued, my voice gaining strength. So we dropped the city on it. The words hung in the air, thick with sacrilege. Valerius looked at me as if I had just suggested we all space ourselves. You propose we destroy the spindle, our home. Everything we have left. We cut one loose, I clarified, pointing to the lowest, most decayed section. Pylon Gamma. Sector 12 through 18. It's mostly abandoned storage and derelict fabrication bays. We use sequential cutting charges on the primary support struts. Sever its tether to the main spire and let it fall. A controlled demolition. It weighs over 300 million tons. It will be a hammer blow they won't see coming. It was an ugly plan. A desperate plan. It was the plan of a scavenger, a rigger who knew that sometime, to save the whole, you had to amputate the dying parts. The council threw me out. They called my idea madness, the talk of a coward who was afraid to die an honorable death in battle. But not everyone dismissed it. Later that cycle, as I was recalibrating the atmospheric regulators in the lower decks, a shadow fell over me. It was Lena, a pilot whose reputation was as sharp and dangerous as the shrapnel scars on her flight jacket. She flew a beat-up scavenger skiff she called the Magpie, and she'd pulled more valuable tech out of the debris field than anyone. She leaned against a bulkhead, arms crossed, her eyes missing nothing. "I heard your speech," she said, her voice a low hum. "You've got guts. Rigger. Or you're an idiot. Haven't decided which." I grunted, not looking up from my work. "Does it matter? The council's plan is suicide," she stated, not as a question. "They'll fly out there, fire their pea shooters, and the janitor will swat them out of the sky before they get within 1,000 kilometers. I've seen his point defense systems. They're automated, fast, and they don't miss." She paused, kicking at a loose floor panel. "But your plan, it's insane. It's patricide, but it might work." That's how it started, not with a call to arms, but with a quiet, reluctant acknowledgement of a shared, terrifying truth. Lena knew the sky, and I knew the steel. We needed one more piece. We found him in the gantry, a cavernous, zero-G space where the riggers did their most dangerous work, suspended by magnetic clamps over a dizzying drop into the spindle's core. Yorick was the oldest rigger, my mentor, a man whose hands were more calloused steel than flesh. He was laughing, a booming sound that echoed in the vast chamber as he welded a new joint onto a groaning support arm. He didn't believe in safety tethers. He said if the spindle decided it was your time to go, a rope wasn't going to argue with it. We told him the plan. He listened, his head tilted, a wild grin spreading across his face. When we were done, he threw his head back and laughed again. Louder this time. "Burn the church to stay warm. I love it," he roared. The old men in the hub have been polishing their metals for so long they've forgotten what it takes to actually live. They'd rather die in a pretty fireball than get their hands dirty with a real solution. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, nearly sending me spinning into the void. "Count me in, Sakid. It's about time someone reminded the architects that ghosts can still haunt." Our small conspiracy grew. A few other riggers, young and disillusioned, a comms tech who was tired of broadcasting the council's propaganda, a demolitions expert who'd been demoted for his unsanctioned experiments. We were the spindle's rejects, the ones who lived in the guts and understood that survival was never clean. While the council prepared their gunships for their glorious charge, we began our work in secret, moving through the forgotten corridors and service tunnels of Pylon Gamma. The place was a tomb, thick with the dust of decades and the ghosts of abandoned projects. We laid the cutting charges, hundreds of them, each one placed with a surgeon's precision on the load-bearing joints I had mapped out in my mind 1,000 times. Every weld, every strut, every rivet was a note in a symphony of destruction I was composing. The day of the Council's attack came. We watched on a stolen feed in our hidden workshop as the 4 gunships, our entire fleet, launched from the spindle. They looked like brave, foolish fireflies against the infinite black. Lena was right. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted 93 seconds. The janitor didn't even seem to notice them at first. Then, a series of precise, needle-like beams of blue light lanced out from hidden emplacements on its hull. The gunships vanished in silent, expanding blossoms of fire and vaporized metal. There was no communication from the Council, no retreat order, just static. A profound, damning silence fell over the spindle. The authority of the elders had been atomized along with their ships. Then, the spindle shuddered. A deep, resonant groan vibrated through the deck plates. The janitor, its patience finally exhausted, had fired its primary tractor beam and locked onto our central comms tower. It was beginning to pull us apart. There were no more options. It was our turn. Jorik, Lena, and I made our way to the makeshift command center we'd rigged in a maintenance node deep within the pylon's core. The air was cold, recycled, and tasted of ozone from the overloaded power conduits. Lena manned the comms, monitoring the janitor's position. Jorik double-checked the charge sequences. I stood before the detonator, a crude device built from a salvaged mining console. On the screen was a simple schematic Pylon Gamma, a glowing red appendage on the body of our home. My hand trembled as I lifted it over the activation panel. This wasn't just steel and wire. It was history. It was where my grandfather had worked, where families had once lived before the decay set in. I was about to murder a part of my world to save the rest. It's in position. Kyle. Lena's voice was tight, strained, dead center beneath us. If you're going to do it now. Jorik gave me a grim nod. Make it count, kid. I looked at the screen, at the numbers ticking down as the janitor's tractor beam intensified its pull, and I closed my eyes. I didn't see the ship below. I saw the faces of my parents, lost in the first fall. I saw the children in the creche, their futures hanging by the threads I was about to cut. This wasn't vengeance. It was survival. My fingers brushed the cold surface of the panel. I pressed down. The first charge fired with a heavy, satisfying thud that we felt more than heard, a heartbeat beginning a countdown to oblivion. One after another, the explosions echoed up the spire, a cascade of controlled, violent severance. The deck beneath us bucked and tilted violently. Pylon Gamma, our home, our weapon, our sacrifice, began to fall. There was no gravity. Then there was too much. The pylon didn't just fall, it was torn away. For a terrifying second, we were weightless, floating in a cloud of agitated dust and the ghosts of our own exhaled breath as the main spindle structure ripped free. Then, the pylon began its slow, terminal tumble toward Earth's gravity well, and a semblance of weight returned, pulling us not toward the floor, but toward the outer hull. The corridor tilted 45 degrees, becoming a steep, treacherous slope. The sound was a symphony from hell, the agonizing shriek of 1,000,000 tons of metal protesting its own murder, punctuated by the deep, percussive booms of snapping support beams and rupturing conduits. Emergency lights flickered, casting the chaos in strobes of blood red, making the dancing shadows of debris look like frantic, tormented spirits. Yorick was laughing, a wild, unhinged sound that was somehow more terrifying than the station's death throes. He'd braced himself against a structural rib, his magnetic boots holding firm. "Did you feel that?" "Kids," he bellowed over the din. That was the sound of history turning a corner. Lena was already moving, her pilot's instincts overriding the sensory overload. "Stow the philosophy. Old man, the Magpie is docked 3 levels down in Auxiliary Bay 7. If we're not on it in 5 minutes, we're going to be the main ingredient in a very large, very hot plasma stew." She was right. We were on a clock, and the clock was Earth's gravity. The journey through the dying pylon was a nightmare descent. Corridors that I had known my entire life, that I could have navigated blindfolded, were now alien landscapes of twisted metal and exposed wiring that spat angry blue sparks. The air grew thin, filled with the acrid smell of burning insulation and the metallic tang of vaporized coolant. We moved in a lurching, half-climbing, half-sliding scramble. A section of the main concourse had collapsed, blocking our path with a mountain of debris. Yorick didn't hesitate. He unhooked a plasma cutter from his belt and began carving a hole through a weakened bulkhead, showering us in a fountain of molten slag. He worked with the frantic energy of a man who is truly alive for the first time, his grin illuminated by the torch's fierce glare. As we scrambled through the freshly cut passage, I caught a glimpse through a reinforced viewport. The view stole the air from my lungs. The main spindle was receding above us, a wounded silver spire against the velvet black of space, its lower section a raw, open wound. And below, the janitor was growing larger with terrifying speed. It was a predator, still unaware that its prey was about to fall on its head. It was still pulling, its tractor beam focused on the spindle's tower, oblivious to the 300-million-ton hammer we had just dropped. We reached the docking bay with seconds to spare. The cavernous space was a maelstrom of screaming alarms and venting atmosphere. Lena's skiff, the Magpie, was still clamped to its mooring, shuddering as the pylon's integrity failed around it. It was an ugly ship, a collage of mismatched parts and welded-on armor plates. But right then, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Get the clamps," Lena yelled, already scrambling up the boarding ramp. "Manual release. The bay's power grid is shot. Jorik and I got to work." The magnetic clamps were designed to hold the ship steady in 0G, not to be released during a structural collapse under partial gravity. The release levers were frozen solid. While I tried to pry mine loose with a crowbar, Jorik took a more direct approach. He wrapped a heavy chain around the base of his clamp, looped the other end around a support pillar, and then, with a roar that was pure, primal defiance, he kicked the activation switch on his magnetic boots to full power. His body became a living winch. Muscles strained against his worn jumpsuit, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought he was going to tear his own legs off. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, the clamp shuddered and broke free. I managed to get mine released a moment later, and we scrambled aboard the Magpie just as the outer wall of the docking bay peeled away, exposing us to the raw, silent vacuum of space. Lena was already in the cockpit, her hands a blur across the controls. The skiff's engines coughed to life with a familiar, rattling roar that was music to my ears. "Strap in," she barked. "This is going to be rough." She wasn't wrong. She wrenched the Magpie from its cradle, the ship screaming in protest as she pushed its rusted old thrusters far beyond their safety limits. We tumbled out of the dying pylon and into the void. The view from the cockpit was apocalyptic. We were falling alongside our weapon, a city-sized chunk of metal, a monument to human hubris, now reduced to a kinetic projectile below us. The janitor filled the entire viewport. It had finally realized what was happening. We saw the needle-like point defense lasers flicker to life, but they were designed for small, fast targets like gunships, not for an entire district of a city. The beams sliced into the pylon's mass, carving insignificant glowing scars into its hide. It was like trying to stop a landslide with a handful of pebbles. "It's turning," Lena said, her voice a low, focused monotone, trying to present a smaller target. The colossal claw ship was maneuvering, but it was too slow, too massive. It was a beast of burden, not a warrior. It had no chance. "We need to clear the blast radius," I said, my voice hoarse. "The impact will vaporize everything within 100 kilometers. "I know," Lena snapped, her knuckles white on the control yoke. She fired the main thruster, pushing us away from the pylon, angling for an escape trajectory that would skim the edge of Earth's upper atmosphere. The G-forces pressed me back into my seat, a brutal, crushing weight. I watched the distance grow between us and the falling pylon, the seconds stretching into an eternity. Through the side viewport, Yorick was silent for the first time, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and madness. He was watching his masterpiece, the greatest, most audacious act of demolition in human history. The impact happened in absolute soul-crushing silence. One moment, the janitor was a ship. The next, it was the epicenter of a new star. The pylon struck its dorsal side, and the kinetic energy of the collision was instantly converted into a silent, blossoming sphere of pure white light. The janitor's shields, designed for micrometeorites and radiation, held for less than a nanosecond before they were overloaded, incinerated, and erased from existence. The ship itself simply came apart. We saw the great claw-like arms cartwheel away into space, melting as they flew. The central plasma core, breached and destabilized, went critical. The white sphere of the impact was consumed from within by a roiling, furious sun of incandescent blue plasma. The shockwave, a silent ripple of pure energy, washed over us. The Magpie bucked and screamed, every alarm on the console blaring at once. Lena fought for control, her teeth clenched, her body rigid with strain. The ship's patchwork shielding glowed cherry red, then white, as it absorbed the thermal blast. For a few seconds, our world was nothing but light and noise and the feeling of being shaken apart at a molecular level. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. We were through the worst of it, coasting on the edge of the void, our ship battered but intact. We were alive. We had done it. Below us, where the janitor had been, there was now a new nebula, a swirling, expanding cloud of superheated gas and molten metal, a funeral pyre for a ship and a testament to our desperation. But the victory was hollow. I looked up at the spindle. It was wounded, a part of it missing forever, but it was still there, and it was no longer being pulled apart. The tractor beam was gone. We had saved it. But as I watched, I saw a flurry of tiny lights detaching from the upper docking rings, escape pods, shuttles. People were abandoning the spindle. And then the comms, which had been a cacophony of static and alarms, cleared for a moment. A single panicked voice cut through, broadcast on an open channel. They did it. The riggers. They attacked the station. They blew up Pylon Gamma. They're trying to kill us all. My blood ran cold. They didn't understand. Or they didn't want to. Valerius and the remnants of the council, in their last moments, must have sent a final message, painting us not as saviors, but as traitors. We hadn't just amputated a limb of our home. We had been branded as the disease. Lena killed the comms receiver. The silence that filled the cockpit was heavier than any gravity. So that's how it is, Jorek said, his voice quiet, the manic glee gone, replaced by a weary bitterness. No medals for this one, I guess. We were adrift. We had a single, battered skiff with limited fuel and life support. We had just declared war on a godlike enemy that had, until now, barely acknowledged our existence, and we had been exiled by the very people we had just saved. I looked from the new, burning star of the janitor's corpse to the distant, silent spindle. We had won the battle, but in that moment, floating in the silent darkness between our handiwork and our home, I realized we had just lost everything else. The ghost had shown it could haunt. Now, the house was on fire, the owners were awake, and we were trapped outside in the dark. The silence in the Magpie's cockpit stretched for what felt like an eternity, thick and suffocating, broken only by the hum of the strained life support and the occasional, mournful groan of the ship's damaged frame. We were pariahs, suspended in the void between a home that had cast us out and an enemy we had just brutally awakened. The nebula of the janitor's remains was already beginning to cool, its incandescent blue fading to a bruised, angry purple. It was a scar on the sky, a scar we had carved. "Fuel?" I finally asked, my voice a dry rasp. The word felt ridiculously mundane, an insult to the scale of what we had just done. Lena's eyes didn't leave the dwindling numbers on her console. Enough to make one burn. We can either try to get back to the spindle and beg for forgiveness, or we can go down. She didn't have to specify what down meant. Earth. The paradise we had been locked out of for generations. The home of the architects. Suicide by cop. Or a leap of faith into the lion's den. Jorek snorted, a sound of pure derision. Forgiveness, Valerius's cronies will space us before we get within spitting distance. They need a scapegoat. And we just handed them our heads on a platter. At least down there, the view will be new. He was right. There was no going back. Our past was a burning bridge. The future was a blue and white marble that held nothing for us but questions and the promise of a swift, elegantly designed death. "Down it is," I said, a strange sense of calm settling over me. The decision, once made, was liberating. We were no longer riggers of the spindle. We were something else now, something unwritten. Lena nodded, her expression grim but resolute. "Strap in again. Re-entry without proper clearance is going to set off every alarm they have. We'll be lucky if we make it to the surface before they send their welcoming committee." She angled the Magpie toward the planet, and with a final, shuddering roar from its abused engines, Our little scavenger skiff began its descent. Breaking atmosphere was like being inside a drum during a hailstorm. The ship rattled and shook, the heat shields glowing a terrifying, molten orange that was visible even through the cockpit's reinforced windows. Warning lights flashed across the console like a panicked constellation. Lena flew with a kind of focused fury, wrestling with the controls, her body a single, tense line of concentration. We were a meteor, a deliberate act of cosmic vandalism, and the planet's defenses reacted accordingly. We saw them on the tactical display, a swarm of small, impossibly fast interceptors rising to meet us. They were shaped like silver teardrops, moving with a fluid grace that made our boxy, utilitarian skiff look like a brick. "Hold on!" Lena shouted over the scream of the engines and the howling atmosphere. She threw the Magpie into a series of gut-wrenching, evasive maneuvers, dropping and weaving, using the atmospheric turbulence as a shield. The interceptors were on us in seconds, flanking us, their energy signatures lighting up our threat display. But they didn't fire. "They're hurting us," Jorik observed, his voice tight with tension. "They're not trying to destroy us. They want us alive." The thought was more chilling than the prospect of being shot down. The architects weren't soldiers. They were builders, planners. They didn't just eliminate problems. They studied them, disassembled them, understood them. We weren't a threat to be neutralized. We were an anomaly to be vivisected. Our descent ended not with a crash, but with a surprisingly gentle, if firm, application of an external force. A tractor beam, far more precise and subtle than the janitor's blunt instrument, locked onto us and guided our descent. We were brought down in a region of towering, crystalline spires that seemed to grow out of the lush, impossibly green landscape. This was no ruin. This was a city, a living, breathing work of art. The buildings were seamless, glowing with a soft internal light, connected by elegant, sweeping bridges. It was a vision of a future we had only ever dreamed of, and it was utterly, terrifyingly alien. The Magpie was set down on a landing platform that materialized from the ground, smooth and white. Before our engines had even fully spooled down, the air around us shimmered, and beings appeared. They weren't 10 foot tall, genetically enhanced soldiers. They were slender, almost frail-looking, encased in form-fitting white suits that seemed to be part of their bodies. They had no visible faces, just smooth, featureless helmets that reflected the perfect sky above. They moved with a silent, coordinated grace, like a troupe of dancers. There was no aggression in their posture, just an unnerving, all-encompassing calm. One of them raised a hand, and a section of our cockpit canopy simply dissolved. The air that rushed in wasn't the canned, recycled air of the spindle. It was clean, sweet, and rich with the scent of vegetation and rain. It was the air of a living world, and it felt like a violation. Jorik, Lena, and I were escorted from the ship, not by force, but by an undeniable sense of inevitability. Our captors didn't touch us, but they flowed around us, their silent presence a cage more effective than any steel bars. We were led into one of the crystalline towers, the interior of which was even more breathtaking than the exterior. The walls were translucent, shifting with soft patterns of light. There was no visible technology, no consoles or wires, just smooth surfaces and an ambient, pleasant hum. It was a world without seams, without grit, Without the rust and grime that had defined our entire existence, it was perfect, and it made my skin crawl. We were brought to a circular chamber. The being who seemed to be in charge stood before us. Its suit was subtly different, adorned with patterns of light that shifted more rapidly than the others. It didn't speak with a voice, but with a thought that bloomed directly in our minds, a sensation that was both intimate and profoundly invasive. You have committed an act of significant and unplanned deconstruction. The voice was calm, analytical, without a hint of anger or malice. It was the voice of a project manager discussing an unexpected budget overrun. Yorick, ever defiant, spat on the flawless white floor. The gob of saliva sizzled and evaporated before it could even form a puddle. "You started it," he growled aloud. "You were going to scrap our home." The orbital structure designated Spindle is a decaying, unstable artifact. Its continued presence poses a significant gravitational and radiological hazard to the planetary reclamation project. Its decommissioning was scheduled and necessary. "We call it home," Lena shot back, her voice ringing with a fury that felt out of place in this serene chamber. "We were born there. We live there." The concept of home is a function of emotional attachment to a suboptimal environment. It is an inefficient variable. The cold, detached logic was more infuriating than any threat. They didn't hate us. They didn't fear us. They simply didn't rate us. We were a rounding error in their grand equation. The method of your intervention, however, is of interest. The voice continued in our minds. The kinetic force calculation, the use of a gravitational fall as a delivery system for a decommissioned habitat. It displays a rudimentary but effective understanding of applied physics. It is creative. There was a pause, a mental beat where I could almost feel it processing, cataloging. We wished to understand the logic matrix that led to this solution. We wish to understand you. I finally found my voice. "What are you going to do with us?" I asked, the words feeling small and clumsy in the face of their silent, mental communication. The patterns of light on the lead architect's suit swirled. "We will do what we have always done. We will build, and to build, we must first understand all the components. You are a new component, an interesting one. You will be disassembled." The word was not a threat of physical violence. It was something far worse. It was a promise of intellectual and spiritual dissection. They were going to take us apart, piece by piece, not with knives and scalpels, but with their cold, relentless curiosity, until every memory, every emotion, every spark of defiance that made us human was laid bare, catalogued, and rendered inert. We had fallen from the sky, not into a prison, but into a laboratory, and we were the rats. As this realization dawned, the serene white walls of the chamber seemed to press in on me, and for the first time since we had dropped the pylon, I felt the cold, sharp sting of true fear. Our disassembly began not with a physical examination, but with a profound and violating stillness. We were separated, each placed in a featureless white room that was more a sensory deprivation chamber than a cell. There were no corners, no seams, no visible doors. The floor, walls, and ceiling were a single, continuous curve of a material that felt like cool, smooth stone. Light emanated from the surface itself, cycling through a gentle, calming rhythm that mimicked a day-night cycle. At regular intervals, a panel would glow and recede, revealing a tray of nutrient paste, a tasteless, beige substance that satisfied hunger without the inefficient distraction of flavor. Waste vanished into a similar, silent portal. It was a perfect, self-contained system for keeping a biological component alive and quiescent. It was maddening. They left us to steep in that sterile silence, a deliberate tactic. I realized you're to strip away the familiar chaos of our lives and leave our minds raw and exposed for their inspection. The first session came without warning. The light in my room dimmed, and a mental presence, the same calm, analytical voice from the central chamber, filled my consciousness. It wasn't in the room with me. It was the room. Component Kyle. Subject motivational analysis of pylon gamma event. Begin. It didn't ask questions. It pulled. I felt a disorienting lurch as my own memories were accessed, unspooled like data from a drive. I was standing again in the hub, facing the council. The words, "You're planning a funeral," tasting like ash in my mouth. I felt the cold certainty of our impending doom. The desperate and ugly logic of my plan blooming in the darkness. The architect's presence sifted through it all. A silent, curious observer. The decision matrix is flawed. The presence concluded, its thought voice tinged with the faintest hint of confusion. Input data indicated a 97.4% probability of mission failure and subsequent termination of all operatives. The logical course of action was surrender or inaction. Your chosen path was illogical. It was survival. I projected back. A clumsy Yeats House's shouted thought. You don't just roll over and die because the math is bad. The concept of survival at the cost of habitat and social cohesion is a paradox. You destroyed your home to save it. You alienated your species to protect it. These are inefficient, contradictory variables. The session ended as abruptly as it began, leaving me reeling, my own memories feeling foreign and tainted by its sterile analysis. I learned later that Lena and Jorik had undergone similar sessions. Lena had fought it, trying to build mental walls, to scream profanities into the void of its consciousness. She said it was like trying to punch water. Her anger simply passed through it, noted and filed away as heightened emotional response. Jorik, on the other hand, had reveled in it. He'd flooded the link with every crude joke, every bawdy song, every memory of brawling and drinking he could conjure. He'd tried to break the machine by feeding it garbage data. If the perfect bastard wants to know what makes a man tick, he'd told me during a brief, architect-permitted intersection in a corridor, his voice echoing in the pristine silence. I'm going to show him the rusty, greasy, glorious mess of it all. But I knew that mockery, like anger, would be just another variable for them to analyze. They weren't looking for a fight. They were looking for a schematic. That's when my old instincts began to stir. I wasn't a pilot like Lena, built for action, or a force of nature like Jorik. I was a rigger. My entire life had been spent observing systems, finding their stress points, their hidden weaknesses, the places where the neat blueprints met the messy reality of function. This perfect city, this seamless prison, was a system. And every system has an infrastructure. Every god has guts. I began to watch. I stopped eating the nutrient paste the moment it appeared, instead timing how long the panel remained open. 27.3 seconds. Every time, I noted the faint, almost subaudible hum that pervaded the room, and realized its pitch changed slightly. A 3-second dip every 4.8 minutes. A power cycle. A data buffer clearing. I started mapping it out, scratching a timeline into the back of a nutrient tray with a sharpened edge, a crude piece of record-keeping in a world without history. I was looking for the rust. In a world of seamless perfection, the smallest imperfection would be a Rosetta Stone. I found it in the waste disposal. It was, by its very nature, the one part of this perfect system that had to deal with imperfection, our messy, biological waste. It was the point of contact between their clean world and our dirty one. My plan was stupidly simple, an act of childish vandalism that Yorick would have adored. For 3 cycles, I didn't use the disposal. I hid the trays, smearing the bland paste on the underside of the recessed ledge where my sleeping platform emerged. It was disgusting, but necessary. I was creating an anomaly, an unscheduled buildup of inefficient biological material. On the 4th cycle, when the waste panel opened, I shoved all 3 trays, smeared with the sticky paste, into the opening just as it began to close. It was a clumsy or forceful act in a world built on effortless grace. The panel tried to slide shut, met resistance, and for a fraction of a second, it hesitated. The system, for the first time since my arrival, didn't know what to do. The panel retracted, then tried to close again. Faster this time, with more force. There was a faint, cracking sound, a noise so out of place in this silent world that it was like a gunshot. Then, the panel jammed halfway, leaving a dark, open maw in the perfect white curve of my room. The hum in the room changed, rising in pitch to an anxious whine. The architect's mental presence flooded my mind, but this time it wasn't calm. It was a flurry of confused, overlapping queries. Anomaly detected, system error, illogical input, material obstruction in quadrant 7, node sigma. It wasn't speaking to me. I was eavesdropping on its frantic, internal diagnostics. It had never encountered a jam before. It had no protocol for shit-smeared trays being shoved where they don't belong. I peered into the opening. Behind the smooth white wall was not more of the same, but a dark, narrow void. It was a service conduit, filled with a dense web of glowing fiber optic cables and coolant pipes that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light. It was the mess. It was the wiring closet, the sewer pipe, the access tunnel. It was the city's guts. A moment later, a maintenance drone, a floating silver sphere, zipped into my room through a newly materialized iris in the wall. It went straight to the jammed panel, extending delicate, multi-jointed arms to clear the obstruction. But I didn't care about the drone. I was staring at the iris it had come through. It had opened a door, a real door, with edges and a threshold. The architect's attention was entirely focused on the problem of the jam. It saw my act of sabotage as a system failure to be corrected, not as a deliberate test of its defenses. It had cataloged my mind, but it had never considered that I might use my body, that I might interact with its world in a physical, primitive, messy way. The drone finished its work. The broken trays dematerialized with a soft hiss, and a new, flawless panel slid into place over the opening. The iris in the wall that the drone had used sealed itself shut, but it was too late. The damage was done, not to the wall, but to my perception. The illusion of seamless perfection was shattered. I had seen behind the curtain. This place wasn't magic. It was a machine. A very advanced, very clean machine, but a machine nonetheless. And any machine can be broken. That night, when the light in my room dimmed, I didn't sleep. I lay on my platform, staring at the flawless white wall, but seeing the dark, tangled truth behind it. My fear was gone, replaced by a cold, familiar sense of purpose. For the first time since we'd fallen, I felt the phantom, beautiful grit of rust under my fingernails. We had found a seam, and I was a rigger. The plan began with a jam. I replicated my little act of sabotage, shoving the accumulated nutrient trays into the waste disposal. The system, having no updated protocol for such a primitive, illogical attack, faulted in precisely the same way. The maintenance drone was dispatched. The iris to the service conduit opened. This time, I was ready. The moment the drone passed through, I scrambled after it, a ghost in its slipstream, diving into the dark, tangled guts of the perfect city. The iris snapped shut behind me, sealing me in the machine's hidden skeleton. The contrast was dizzying. I had left a world of serene, seamless light and entered a realm of absolute function. There were no aesthetics here, only purpose. Bundles of glowing optical fibers, thick as my arm, pulsed with the city's data. The lifeblood of the architect's shared consciousness. Coolant pipes sweated cold condensation onto my hands as I navigated the cramped, zero-G space. The city's gentle hum was magnified in here to a constant, resonant roar. I was inside the beast. Finding the others was a matter of rigor's logic. I couldn't search for them, but I could search for their inefficiency. I followed the conduits for waste management, the only system that had direct, physical contact with them. I found Lena's room first, identifying her node by the faint, unique biological signature I saw flickering in a diagnostic stream running along a nearby fiber. I couldn't risk a mental call, so I did the only thing I could. I banged on the thin metal of the conduit wall, a frantic, desperate rhythm. Clang, 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 clang. It was a rigger's distress signal, a code we used when comms were out in the deep gantries of the spindle. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a faint, hesitant knock came back. Tap, 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 tap. She was there. She was alive. I found a junction box, pried it open with the sharpened edge of my nutrient tray, and began the slow, painstaking work of rerouting the control feed for her node's maintenance iris. Orcs was easier to find. His node was pulsing with anomalous energy readings. He was fighting, constantly, not just mentally, but physically, testing the limits of his sterile box, creating a constant stream of diagnostic flags that made his location on the network light up like a distress flare. When I finally bypassed the lock on his iris and it slid open, he wasn't surprised. He was grinning, covered in sweat, having just finished trying to rip his sleeping platform from the wall with his bare hands. "Took you long enough, kid," he boomed, his voice a glorious, human violation in the machine's heart. I was getting bored. Lena joined us minutes later, slipping through the conduit like a phantom, her eyes alight with a fierce, predatory gleam. The pilot was back in her element behind enemy lines with a clear, impossible objective. "What's the plan?" "Call," she asked, her voice a low whisper that still seemed to echo in the humming darkness. "They think we're a data problem," I explained, gesturing to the pulsing river of light around us. "They're trying to analyze our minds. They've completely ignored our bodies, Our ability to physically interact with their world, their greatest strength, this shared, perfect consciousness, is also their greatest weakness. It has a central point, a nexus. We don't destroy it. We jam it. We introduce a variable so illogical, so messy, so human, that the entire system chokes on it. Yorick's grin widened. You want to throw a wrench in the gears? I want to be the wrench, I corrected. We move through the city's veins, a virus in the bloodstream of a god. We followed the densest conduits of data and power toward the core, a journey that took us beneath the serene plazas and through the structural hearts of the crystalline towers. We saw the city's true form, a colossal, intricate circuit board, and its inhabitants were merely terminals connected to a single, flawless server. The Nexus was not a room. It was a cathedral of light. We emerged from a conduit into a vast, spherical chamber. In the center, suspended in a web of pure energy, was a crystalline structure that seemed to breathe, pulsing with the soft, rhythmic light of a billion synchronized thoughts. This was the architect's mind, their soul, their server. Floating around it were the elders, the lead architects, their white-suited forms inert, their consciousnesses fully integrated with the whole. And then we saw the system's one, true vulnerability. A series of coolant pipes, not unlike the ones we had followed, fed directly into the base of the crystalline structure, pumping a shimmering, translucent fluid to keep the core from overheating. It was the only physical input into a system of pure thought. That's our way in, Lena whispered, pointing. Our plan was crude, desperate, and beautiful in its simplicity. We had brought with us the only contaminant we could find, the nutrient paste. We had several trays of the stuff, a beige, sticky, inefficiently organic mess. Lena would create a diversion, overriding a localized power junction to cause a surge. Jork and I would use the resulting diagnostic chaos to get to the coolant intake. It worked perfectly. Lena shorted the junction, and a section of the chamber flickered, the ambient hum rising in alarm. The architect's mental presence, which had been a calm, monolithic wall, fractured into 1,000 panicked queries. They were distracted. Jork and I moved. He used his plasma cutter to slice open the primary coolant pipe, releasing a hiss of vapor. The moment he did, I shoved the sticky, messy, biological nutrient paste into the opening. All of it. For a moment, nothing happened. The system absorbed the contaminant, the shimmering fluid carrying the beige sludge toward the core. Then, the crystal at the center of the chamber stuttered. The soft, rhythmic pulse faltered. The light inside turned a sickly, flickering yellow. The architect's voice flooded our minds, but it was no longer one. It was a chorus of 1 billion panicked, individual voices, screaming in confusion. Anomaly. Biological contaminant in primary core. Illogical, inefficient. What is a taste? What is? Texture system error. I can't. Think. Who is I? The unified consciousness shattered. The architects, for the first time in millennia, were alone in their own heads. Their perfect machine, faced with a variable it could not compute, was crashing. The world outside began to break. Lights flickered and died. The seamless walls began to show their seams, panels retracting, revealing the dark conduits behind them. The serene hum of the city was replaced by a cacophony of wailing alarms. The architects in the chamber convulsed, their suits flickering as they were violently disconnected from the nexus. They were no longer a god. They were just a collection of terrified, isolated individuals. We walked out. We didn't run. We walked through the dying, glitching city, past architects who huddled on the ground, their featureless helmets now seeming to convey a sense of utter, bewildered panic. We made it back to the landing platform where the Magpie sat, a monument to rust and imperfection in a world of dying light. As we lifted off, leaving the city of broken gods behind, we saw the true extent of our work. The beautiful, crystalline towers flickered, their internal light unstable. The perfect order was gone, replaced by a beautiful, chaotic randomness. We hadn't destroyed them. We had given them a gift more terrible and more precious than any weapon individuality. The doubt, the fear, the chaos of being alone, the messy, inefficient variables that made us human. We had taught the machine to dream, and it was having a nightmare. We flew back into the darkness, our little ship battered and scorched, leaving a wounded planet behind us. I looked at the view screen. Ahead of us was the void, and somewhere in it, the wounded, waiting spindle. Behind us, the janitor's nebula still glowed, a faint, rust-colored stain against the stars. We were exiles no more. We were a story, a myth in the making. The ghosts who had not only haunted the machine, but had given it a soul. We weren't conquerors. We weren't heroes. We were riggers. And we had just left the entire galaxy with a single, terrifying, unanswered question: what happens when a god forgets how to be perfect?